Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Gen Ed. Today, we're super excited to be joined by Carter Martindale, the former business director for Wave. And actually, I'm not sure what your current your current position is, but Carter, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dan. So I'm currently one of the legal leads
Hmm.
for Wave. My name's Carter, as Dan said. I'm originally from a tiny town in northern Utah, and studying remotely in Provo, Utah Central, actually the same area as Dan, if our listeners didn't know. I'm a rising junior now at Harvard College. I'm studying government, which is like political science, and essentially getting a minor in Russian studies. And let's see, I don't know, I enjoy long walks on the beach, reading, binging shows on Netflix, and I'm pretty involved in like other public service clubs at Harvard.
Nice. So what do you want to do after graduation?
So the current plan is law school, right? I guess we'll be pending the LSAT and how that goes. But yeah, I want to go to law school. I'll probably do public service law, focusing on like issues of poverty or like homelessness. When I allow myself to dream, I want to be a judge, but that's not really something you can like plan for. You have to be appointed. So
No, yeah, I've given law school some thought myself. I'm not sure if that will end up being the path for me, but it's very daunting, talking to lawyers, most of whom just like hate their jobs.
yeah, see, that's the thing is when everyone tries to talk me out of it, that's when I wonder, oh, like maybe this isn't the right
Maybe
path.
Okay,
there's something to what they're saying.
but Legally Blonde, like, love that movie. I think
But
I
legally
just
blonde.
watched it the other day. But,
Oh, it's iconic.
nothing like actual law school, so
I mean, I don't know. I haven't been, so maybe it
Exactly. Could be 100% accurate.
is.
Um, but as you mentioned, you're currently a student at Harvard, um, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. It's nice. It's a fun thing to have.
And I was, I guess, a little spooked to learn that you work with the admissions office at Harvard, right? I didn't know that students really could work in college admissions offices, but I guess I hadn't given it much thought. Um, how did you end up working in the admissions office?
Yeah. So it was kind of surprising for me as well, honestly. I guess I should have included this as part of my intro. But I'm what's called a student coordinator with the Harvard Financial Aid Initiative, or HFI. It's like our acronym. And there's three or four like student recruitment groups within the Harvard admissions office. And I actually got hired on like as a part of a tangential program called Hometown Recruiting, where every winter, like over our winter break, which is pretty big, it's about 6 weeks, parts of the admissions office will hire students to go back to their home town or home area, or in my case, it was like the whole state of Utah. And actually, yeah, because I mean, it's not a super urban place. And I
It's not
just
exactly
traveled
a massive
around.
feeder to Harvard.
No, there were like seven of us from Utah who got in the year I graduated high school. But I mean, thus the recruiting, because basically Harvard pays us to like go to high schools, talk about Harvard. I specifically talked about like financial aid, and getting admitted to a school like Harvard or other Ivy Leagues, and really just trying to like pump the kids up and tell them, yes, it is possible. Like, yes, you can pay for this type of education. And I loved that job. I did that the winter break of like my freshman fall, and then a job opened up with their full time team, and they asked me to come back, and so I hopped on board. We don't do like the general admissions officer work. Like I'm not
Yeah,
reading students' applications, and like deciding who gets in, who I want to have as my competition. But we really just like try to be a resource for students, and then also for the low income students on campus.
that's really nice. That makes me like wish I would have applied to, some school like Harvard, but I didn't. But I think I ended up in a good place. But could you tell me a little bit more about like what your college application process was like? How did you end up choosing Harvard or applying?
Yeah. So, oh boy, three fun parts of that question, I guess. In general, the application process was it was kind of hectic. As like Dan alluded to, Utah isn't a big like feeder school or feeder state to any like big Ivy League or honestly out of state schools at all. So most of what I learned about applying to school outside of Utah, I did on my own. Lots of just like, research, Google, random school websites, because my counselor was great, but he was like, honestly, I can't help you. He's like, I
Yeah.
don't really know anything either. Um, so I like eventually, came up with a list of schools that I felt was good. I heard about the whole formula of like, oh yeah, have like a couple reach schools, schools you probably won't get into, but maybe you can, some target ones where you feel comfortable, and then a safety school. So I did all of that. I applied. I finished everything up about November. Harvard was not one of those schools, and then I had some extra time before the application like process closed up, and I thought, well, like why not? Like, the worst they say is no. So I've always heard about Harvard. I might as well figure something out. So I like, did the Harvard supplement on the Common App. I'd already written like the most part of my application, so it wasn't too hard. Sent it in, regular decision. So that was in like January. I got my acceptance. Was obviously very very excited, but still like trying to weigh like where I wanted to go. What's the right atmosphere? I don't know anyone at Harvard. I haven't really been to the East Coast, but I was at a Harvard alumni like basically meet and greet for all of the admitted students from Utah. And the director at the time, Richard Mackey, he got up, gave this little spiel about why we should go. But then he ended with this one sentence that like honestly made the decision for me. He was like, "Hey, at the end of the day, like you're never going to regret saying you went to Harvard." Um,
What a
and
quote.
yeah, that kind of hit me. I was like, oh, like if I turned down Harvard and, maybe go to Duke, which is a great school, I really thought about going there. That was one of my biggest options. I was like, there might be a day where I felt like bad about turning down Harvard. Um, and that's not the ideal way you should choose going to a school. There's definitely like other factors that fell into place, and I love it there. But that was my personal thought process.
Yeah, so you talked about the semi lack of support from like the high schools, when you're applying. Definitely definitely something that is an issue in the state of Utah. Yeah, they're just not used to kids applying to schools that aren't BYU or the University of Utah.
Yeah.
Um, even I probably went to a much bigger high school than you, up
Yeah,
in
I mean,
Logan.
yeah, a little bit.
But even at my large like 6A school, yeah, my counselors were not prepared for kids applying really out of state that much. And so I went through a kind of similar process to you of having to kind of figure stuff out myself. Neither of my parents went to Ivy League schools. Both of them went to BYU. And so I went through a similar process of having to figure stuff out online kind of by myself, and that led to some regrets, right? You don't learn some
Mhm.
things until a little bit too late. Particularly, I started my application process probably a little too late. Was there
Uh,
anything that you, looking back on your kind of college application process, was there anything that you wish you had done a little bit differently? I mean, obviously you still got admitted to an Ivy League school, so it's kind of difficult to like nitpick at that point, but anything you wish you would have done differently?
uh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there were like still schools I got rejected from, right? So I wasn't the perfect
Yeah.
college applicant. But my like the two biggest things I wish I had known applying, because as you mentioned, yeah, again, like there aren't a lot of resources and support. One is just starting earlier. I think that's a big problem I run into, even like doing these different recruiting sessions. I'll have like a senior come and they'll be super, super excited. They'll really, really want to apply, but it's like January 7th. The
Yeah.
deadline was January 1st. And you're like, I would love for you to come and apply, but it's just, it's too little too late. Um, so I wish I had started doing research a little bit earlier, maybe like the summer after my junior year. So I could have started essays earlier to really make sure you have time to like flush out that narrative and really get those essays on lock. Um, And then the second thing I wish I would have done, just because like I didn't know this was a thing until I got to Harvard, was like when you're getting your letters of recommendation, tons of kids, and like what you should do, the common practice, is to like approach those teachers or those mentors and like tell them what you want them to write about.
Mm.
So obviously you can't, write the letter of recommendation, like that's academically dishonest and they need to do it. But you could definitely advise them, say, oh, like, you were the club advisor for my debate team and I was like in a leadership position for 3 years. Can you write about like my leadership? Because that was something you saw, that was something you can personally speak to, and really using those letters of recommendation to continue crafting that story and kind of show off your strengths more. My letters of rec were just like, hey, like, yeah, I know you pretty well. Can you like write a letter? And they're like, cool,
Yeah.
yeah, sure. And I just had no idea what was in it. And it worked out, but it might not always work out. So I think that's the other thing, is just like not being afraid to approach those writers of the letters of rec and saying, can you speak to this?
Yeah, I feel like you have some little bit of behind the scenes or insight into what the college admissions process is like since you do work in the admissions part of like Harvard. So could you tell us a little bit of what you learned after applying and being accepted to Harvard and attending? Any insight or insider tips or just stuff that you like didn't realize was out there until you worked there?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, I mean, yeah, what I just shared was definitely one of them. That was like a piece of advice that I heard like a admissions officer giving after I first joined the team, and I was like, oh, I did not know that. Um, but in general, I think I was really just like it was further impressed upon me, like the grind that admissions officers go through as well. Like we always talk about how it's a slog for us because it is. You're writing a lot of applications, you're doing a lot of research, you're trying to get into a lot of schools, but these admissions officers are reading, thousands of applications, or individually like hundreds over a period of a few short weeks, and they have to make these decisions of who to recommend, of who to not endorse based on that very like limited information that they have in the application. And so I'd always heard that like you need to put time into your essays and you need to make sure that like your personality shines through, but that really hit home after working in the admissions office, because like at the end of the day all they have are those like 10, 12 pages from the common app to distinguish you between like the other 50 kids that they read about that day. um, and so when we talk about like making sure you have a narrative, or making sure you're telling a story with your college application, I know that's true, because if the admissions officer isn't able to like remember who you are, they can't really tell much more about you than like your test scores or what clubs you did in high school. You're really not going to do very well at all. um, and then the final thing I guess I would like put out there is I realized that like you don't have to be perfect, right, to like get into a good school. I mean, one, I realized that like when I got in, but two, like we we did like mock like application like read throughs as a team to kind of like simulate what an admissions officer actually does. And like reading it over, it wasn't like, oh, an instant deal breaker that this kid didn't get like a perfect SAT score, or this kid didn't have a 4.0, like that's the end of the day. Like no, like these kids didn't have perfect tests, they didn't have perfect grades, but it was really like seeing their accomplishments and seeing what like drove them outside of class or like as an individual that really shined through and like caused us to like quote unquote pick one student over another.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make. I think a lot of what you're able to accomplish is what you think you're able to accomplish. And I think a lot of students sell themselves short on what's possible. They think that, you know, obviously with Ivy League schools, pretty much no matter who you are, it's going to be a bit of a long shot because it's just such a small admission rate.
Yeah.
Um, But I mean, I remember when I went through my college application process, like I said, I started a little bit later than I probably should have. And I didn't even apply to that many schools. I was just kind of lazy. And at the end of my application process, though, I wanted to submit an application to Princeton,
Mm.
and it was like the last week before early admit applications were due, and I'm just cranking out all of my schools because I wanted them all to be early admit. Um, and I think I wrote I think I wrote my main Princeton supplement the day before. It was
Oh no.
and then I gave myself a day to sleep on it, and then I looked over it the next day. It was due at like noon the next day, and I looked
Oh,
over it the next day and then submitted it. And I had delayed my Princeton one beyond my other schools because I was like, oh, it's a long shot in the first place. Like it
mm,
doesn't matter if I, don't have a ton of time for it. But looking back, I think that I may have had slightly more of a shot than I was giving myself credit for. And it kind of became a self fulfilling prophecy where I'm not saying that if I had started earlier, I would have been admitted to Princeton, but, um, but it definitely became a self fulfilling prophecy where I didn't really believe that I had much of a shot. And so I prioritized other schools and other applications. And then I didn't put my best foot forward at the school that I needed to put the best foot forward at. Um, so I think that is a really important message to get out, that if you have a good story to tell, and if you're an interesting person and you're able to reflect that well in your application, then you really have a shot anywhere. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think that that's something that's really not emphasized well by a lot of college counselors, and by just a lot of families, I guess, around the country. But
I give you
so
credit, Dan, for applying because I didn't even apply. I was like, I don't want to pay. Like, I don't want to pay $75 for a rejection letter. Like that's that
I
was
think it
my
more
headspace. So
I think
don't
it
have
more
that
just reflects my
headspace.
hubris.
yeah, and that's where like I definitely understand, and so that's the caveat I give of like depending on your I guess like personal financial situation is like the
Yeah,
worst they say is no. Harvard waives the application fee, no questions asked, if you feel like it's a financial burden to your family. But like if you're in a situation where you have to pay, then I have to say, okay, caveat, the worst that happens is you lose
you lose $70.
$75. Yeah, which is not ideal at all. But I mean, in the scheme of things, depending on your situation, again, I would hope that, I think it's worth it. Because like Dan was really saying, I think that's the biggest thing I've noticed is working with the admissions office is so many kids talk themselves out of it, or just have like unrealistic expectations because of things we hear or like things we see online about what it takes to like go to one of these schools, and lots of the things just aren't true. So like shoot your shot. You might get rejected, right? This isn't saying everyone can get into an Ivy League because there's only a limited number of spots, but I think so many students have a chance to just talk themselves out of it.
Yeah, I just a little tangent related to that. I remember when I was researching schools to apply to, I was shocked at how few people apply to Ivy Leagues.
Mm,
Like the admit rates are very low because the class sizes are really small. But another school that I applied to, the University of Michigan, which has a much larger undergraduate class, has had so many more applicants because it's viewed as not as rigorous to get into. But it was I really kind of thought that, oh, these application I mean these admission rates are so small because just kind of everybody tosses in an application, but really
mm,
it's surprising how few people actually end up applying to these schools. um
yeah,
that being said,
I
and
mean,
kind of talking about putting your best foot forward, we've got you as an insider here. We've got the insider the insider knowledge. What would you say is the type of applicant that Harvard is looking for?
mm. Yeah. So, okay, really quick before I get into that, I have to
Yeah,
share
go for
another
it.
tangent of just continuing that narrative. So, Harvard went test optional this past year, and they will be again for this upcoming class year, meaning students didn't have to submit standardized test scores if they didn't want to. and the number of applicants was a record like number. Like there
Yeah.
was more than any. I forget the exact numbers. I'm like trying to Google it in the background right now, but there were thousands more applications than usual. Again, because I think students who wouldn't have normally applied because they felt like their test scores disqualified them now could because
Yeah.
they didn't have to send in that type of score. And so, like related to that, right? Like, what is Harvard looking for? Like, how do you put your best foot forward? What I always tell students is just first and foremost, you need to be you and you need to be real. So, one, like if you can, focus on something unique. Focus on a unique perspective or a unique background or unique experience that you've had, right? On like one end, that doesn't mean like you need to have, like solved and cured cancer because that would be unique. On the other hand, like that doesn't mean you need to share like personal trauma that you've gone through because you think like, oh, that will set me apart. But you do kind of want to focus on anything that the average applicant is not going to have. But then two, even if you feel like you aren't that unique, just make sure you can like bring that passion and the things that really drive you across in the application. Because the beginning application is the same for everyone. It's like, oh, here's some numbers. Oh, here are some classes that they took. Here are some grades, some test scores. But once you get to the essays and like the extracurriculars, that's really where you can shine through and say, hey, like I have a lot of drive about this, and that's why I'm going to be like a good peer to have on campus because I'm going to like push other people to also do service or like help other people, like be more musically inclined and involved, or whatever it is that you love. Um, yeah, I think that's like the general advice. The other thing I would say, because like it still needs to be addressed, like how an admissions officer explained it to me is like grades and test scores are used as kind of a gauge for whether or not you're going to be able to academically succeed at a school like Harvard. Because at the end of the day, it is rigorous. The course load is a lot of work. The classes are pretty hard, and Harvard doesn't want students to like burn out or feel overwhelmed coming into a situation like that. And so, like they look at grades, they look at test scores, but it's not a either you're in or you're out. It's just looking for evidence that you can like academically and intellectually like survive at an institution like an Ivy League because they are intense.
So with the test optional option for Harvard, does not submitting your scores mean like the rest of your application is weighed more heavily? Or let's say someone got a 1200 on their SATs and they're like, oh, I'm unsure of whether or not I should submit it. Do you have any advice on how a student applying should take that way?
Yeah. So the policy on paper, right, is that not submitting test scores does not disadvantage you in any way. Meaning like it's not going to be held against you. But that being said, like submitting a test score is another data point that like admissions officers have to look at. So usually what I would say is try to, again, like going back to this story, this narrative that I always talk about. If you think that your test score is going to add something to that story, is going to contribute either to like describing who you are as a student or maybe like how you're inclined academically, then I think submit it. Even if it's not perfect, like that's fine. If you think it's going to better like describe and show who you are, then turn it in. If you don't think it adds to anything, or like if on the off chance, like you're just a really really bad test taker and you think it subtracts from like how you succeed academically, then I think it's okay to not submit it. But in that case, again, like I said, you need to make sure the admissions officers can still understand like how you are going to succeed academically without having that test score provided.
I remember when I was doing my pre-application research, watching videos on YouTube,
Yeah.
I heard the term you hear the terms like passion and like tell your story a lot, and you also hear well-rounded a lot, you know. Colleges are looking for well-rounded students. And yet I would always bulk a little bit, because then they would go on to say, like, if you're applying to an Ivy League, you want to be like the absolute best in this one thing, you know? And it's like those seem a little contradictory, but um could you could you expound a little bit on what a well-rounded student is, what qualifies as a well-rounded student um in the eyes of an admissions officer?
Yeah. Um, and as always, this is just my take, my perspective. But at the end of the day, honestly, for me, I think it means they just want to make sure that students aren't robots, and aren't like only focused and only living in this one realm and this one sphere. Because like on the one hand, I guess you don't need to be involved in tons of different things, right? I think lots of time this narrative of like, oh, I need to be well rounded means, oh, I need to be vaguely involved in like seven different clubs that
Yeah.
cover everything from like neuroscience to, I don't know, like ocean biography or whatever. Biology, gosh, obviously I wasn't involved in one of those clubs, so I can't really speak to that. But I think it like Harvard just wants to know that you're a person, and the Ivy Leagues in general, because the classes are so small. They're not just picking people who they think will be like good in classes and will go on to like make money to then contribute to the college in the future. They're looking for people who are going to be good roommates, who are going to be good people to have on campus, people who are going to be involved in different clubs and extracurriculars and sports and research. And so they want to know that you have a personality and that you like exist outside of the classroom. So that's really to me what I think a well-rounded applicant is it's someone who's not just one thing. You're not just a great test score. You're not just a track star. You're not just an amazing musician. You also do one or two things on the side. Um, and yeah, I guess I'll stop myself there because otherwise I'll keep rambling.
What surprises me is those people who have like a long list of all their activities with perfect scores, with perfect everything. And I'm like, how are you an actual person? Like, you make me feel like I do nothing. Uh, like, oh my goodness. So I guess it comes for me like while applying to college, not insecure on my part, but questioning how a college would take like that perfect applicant, I guess, versus like an average person with, who doesn't do a million and one activities. So,
Mhm.
what would
Yeah,
be your advice on that part?
hmm I mean, I think there's two things. One is like an interesting part about the Common App is you have to like list the number of hours that you put into each extracurricular. But even besides that, like at the end of the day, the admissions officers are people too. Like they can kind of see through a list of 20 activities that you were quote unquote involved in and realize there are only 24 hours in the day, right? It was like physically impossible for this person to put more than like 1 or 2 hours a week into each of these clubs. And so they'll kind of see and recognize that breadth, as like if you're sincere, they can tell that. But lots of kids who just try to pack their resume, like the admissions officers have seen it before. They're going to recognize it and they're going to know this is just here for like the resume, right? The people aren't actually passionate about this issue. And so I think that's where like that's the advice I would give to someone who might feel like they're more of an average applicant, right? Who didn't do a lot, is to really focus on why you're like only involved in a couple of those things, and why those things like are your passions and why they've shaped you, if that makes sense. Because like for me, right, even when I was applying, I didn't do like a ton. Like my extracurriculars were like speech and debate. I ran track in the spring, and I was like pretty involved in public service. That was like it. And so like I listed track because that was something I did, like those are little like bonus points. I did enjoy it. But like I mainly just focused on like speech and debate and public service. And I really tried to hammer through like this is like how it has improved me as a person. This is why it makes me like a good peer and a good student. And this is why I'm going to like continue these passions when I get on Harvard's campus. Um, so really just like take time to think, and take time to ask yourself, why do I only do these things? And why does that like still make me a cool person for only doing two or three things? Um, yeah, the final little caveat I'll just add is like if you work like a job, or if you have like at home responsibilities, definitely like take the time to talk about that in the application. Like again, because admissions officers are people, they understand that like there are situations where you need to work, or want to work. There are tons of like good skills that contribute to being a student that come from like working a part-time job during high school. Or if you have family responsibilities at home where you're like, oh, I'm cooking for my siblings, every day, so I can't do another club on top of that. Like that in and of itself is a strength. That's a unique experience that not lots of students are going to have. So you can focus on that as well.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to taking whatever you have and using it to demonstrate how you're a complex and interesting person. And as long as you're able to do that, as long as you're a genuinely complex person, no, as long as you're able to show what makes you unique and why you would be a good addition to a campus community, that's what it's all about. And speaking of kind of the more personal side of an application, real quick, I wanted to pick your brain about like college interviews,
Mm,
because not tons of schools do interviews, and oftentimes they're optional. I only had one school that required or that even had an interview option, and that was Princeton. And it was something I hadn't seen like really anything about online. I waddled into that interview like with no knowledge of what to expect or what to do. And I just kind of winged it, and again might have contributed to Dan's lack of admission to that particular university. But retroactively, I wanted to ask you a little bit about college interviews and what interviewers are looking for and how you can really rock that interview to get a solid recommendation.
mm. Yeah, great question. Because I do think that is something that's really not talked about. It's not like general public knowledge that some of these schools do have interviews. Some are required, some are optional. Um, and it's hard to give like very concrete advice because honestly it kind of depends. Just speaking to like all of my peers, my interview experience was drastically different from other interviews that people had, because it depends on the alumni or the Harvard associate who is doing that interview. um, all those caveats being said, two general pieces of advice. One, like do your research. So like the second you find out the name of who's going to be interviewing you, and if like Harvard doesn't tell you, feel free to send a follow-up email and just be like, could I know who's going to be interviewing me? You should know because they'll personally reach out. But after you get that name, like stalk them on LinkedIn, right? Google them, figure out like, oh, like where are they from? What do they do for work? Are they still involved with Harvard in any capacity or with whatever school you're applying to? Um, and like doing that personal research is really helpful because one, like oftentimes you'll stumble upon maybe some similarities that you have with that interviewer. And so that's something that you can be sure to like talk about or ask about, because obviously, like if you're interested in it and they're interested in it, it's going to be a good and like a comfortable conversation. But then two, it just shows interest, right? It shows that you are prepared. Even if I don't have anything in common with them, or like am frankly not that interested in what they're doing, it's still like polite to ask. And it gives them an opportunity to talk, it gives them an opportunity to show what they're passionate about. And that's good for you to be able to sit and listen and give some productive comments. So like do some research. And then second is just practice. That can be as simple as just Googling like, the 20 most common interview questions, preparing some answers to those, and then sitting down with like a parent or a guardian, sitting down with a sibling, having a random friend at lunch, just like run through a quick 5 to 10 minute interview with them where they ask you a couple questions and you have to answer. Um, Part of that practice as well, I would say, is just like practice some on your feet thinking. So have them just throw you a random question at the end and like see how you can answer it because you really don't know what you're going to get walking into these interviews. So like just being comfortable with talking, being comfortable with sharing stories is a big plus. Um, and so the final thing I'll say is prepare some stories beforehand that you want to share, that you want the interviewer to know about you. Because they'll probably ask about the basic things, like, oh, like what classes are you taking? What are your test scores? What's your GPA? But their letter of recommendation is another opportunity for you to get more personal information about you into the hands of the admissions officers. So coming prepared to say, I want to share this story because it shows off like this aspect of my personality can be really, really helpful. Because then when a question comes up, it'll be really easy to put in that story and demonstrate who you are, not like just with words, but through experience.
Yeah, those are really good tips. The listeners probably heard like my own little interview stories over the past, but you know, uh, I guess a tip is just for me, I like dancing alone in my room, so that's a thing I do. So I would put on a song like really loud and just like dance it out and just try to relax before and then in the interview just be yourself. I know that's kind of cliche, but just be who you are and don't apologize for being yourself. And then in addition to what you were saying, Carter, is those activities that you're in, make sure like you're actually passionate about them when you put them on your like application, like on Common App, because that might be a question like your interviewer may ask you, like, why were you doing this club? Like, what did you learn from it? What did you gain from it? Um, Also, I think one of the hardest questions for me was when was the last time you disappointed someone? And I had to take a
Oh,
minute and like really think. Like that was a difficult question, but
I would have been like, right now, you, the interviewer.
yeah.
One of you.
So
Um,
earlier this morning, let me tell you what my mom said. Like,
yeah, so if you have a difficult question like that, just take a minute, think, come up with something, and be yourself. Don't let the jitters get to you. So as this wraps up, uh Carter, how do you know a school is right for you when after all the applications are done, when you're trying to decide, how can you tell, yes, I want to go to this school, the school's right for me?
I mean, for me, it was a blackmail-ish sounding statement from Richard Mackey. But I think for most people, it I think you need to just like sit back and like barring, don't even think about the colleges you've applied to, but just ask yourself like, if I could choose, like if I could make my own college, like where do I want it to be located? How big is it? What types of opportunities are there? What's the living situation like? What are my peers like? Kind of ask yourself all of these general questions to get a picture of like what your ideal college is, and then try to match it to the schools that you've gotten into. Just sit down and go one by one. Like, oh, this school is not as big as I wanted it to be, but it's like in a really good location. I think after that cursory analysis, second, like don't be afraid to ask the little questions. So try to reach out to like current students and be like, yo, like, is there a kitchen available to me if I want to like make mac and cheese at 3 a.m.? Because that's definitely a situation you're going to be in. And like it might seem little, but it's the little things that add up to like a real college experience. Um, so ask those
real
questions.
quick, I'm just gonna start cold emailing random students. Be like, what about the mac and cheese sitch?
Yeah, you should. And like lots of colleges will have sort of like student ambassadors or student recruiters like me, to where if you like go to their website and just like Google like connect with students, they'll give you emails that you can send these questions to, right? Like these are questions I get in my email like on a day-to-day basis for my job. um, and they're fun, it's like that's a real question that you might have. So don't think anything's like too unimportant to ask about.
I would always
um,
ask, does the room like do the dorms have air conditioning? Because I don't like. I always ask that.
yeah, there are some that don't, like mine did, thankfully, but like I mean a Boston summer is like humid and hot, and so if I was stuck in a freshman dorm that didn't have AC, I probably would have died. Like just something that I did not want. So that's really important. um Trying to think what else before I get to the sappy and like it's all you. Like if possible, visit, right? Like I know that's can be a problem. Depending on your economic background or your situation. If you're an international student, that could be really hard as well. But lots of schools have like fly out programs you can apply to. That's something you kind of need to be aware of like junior year. But that's like a way where schools will pay for you to come and visit their campus. Lots of schools have admitted student days. Like after you get in, they'll like let you come and visit campus and like get a feel. So if you can visit, that's like that can be a deal breaker. Because even if you love the school on paper, like there might be things in person that you're not a fan of. Um, but at the end of the day, like you just need to feel it out. Like I don't think there's a formula. Like even after I told you like make these checklists, like there might just be a school that feels better, that feels right for you. So try to think of yourself, in 2 to 3 years, are you going to be comfortable? Are you going to be able to be yourself at that sort of institution? And if so, then you're not going to make a wrong decision. And if there are 3 or 4 colleges where you feel like you can be yourself, like on the one hand that's harder, but on the other hand that means like you're not going to make a wrong choice. Wherever you end up, you're going to be happy.
Yeah, I think even just pointing to your own experience and asking yourself the question, will I regret this ever?
Yeah.
You know, it's a valid question, You I mean, according to your own experience, ultimately that's what made you make the decision, and it wasn't all the stuff on paper, and it wasn't, you know, all of that calculating. It was just you thinking, will I regret this in the future? Will I regret not coming here? And I think that's underrated, being able to have that peace of mind where you're just happy with where you're at and you don't need a question, whether you should have gone somewhere else, whether you should have done something differently, because that's pretty tough. Even if you're fairly happy at where you currently are, just thinking about, oh, but what if I did this? That's really difficult. um
Yeah, it is. And if I could share one more
yeah,
quick story, I
go.
know we're wrapping up, but yeah, like there, I got, and this is like in no way, shape, or form like trying to stay in another school, but like I got into a different university in Western Massachusetts. It was like really, really small, so I knew I was going to have a ton of like professor focus. It was beautiful. I've been able to visit it. Um, like the financial aid was the same, so it was great, but they offered like on top of that additional like mentoring and additional like guaranteed summer funding for me if I went there. So like kind of on paper, it seemed like this was the school like I should have gone to. And that was the school I was really, really thinking about. But again, like you said, like the thought process of like, am I going to regret going somewhere else kind of like snapped me out of just thinking about the money, and like going where I was going to feel more comfortable. And then I like went and visited that school again after I was already attending Harvard and like was walking around campus and realized, oh yeah, like this is not the place for me. Just like the vibes were off, like I would not entirely fit in on that campus because there were just like different interests and different situations. Um, so yes, having now told you to do the checklist, I'm also telling you don't listen to the checklist all the way through.
Ultimately, throw the checklists out.
Yeah, yeah.
I went off vibes. I went off vibes. And there was also a part of me that was like hesitant for certain schools. Like something was holding me back. And I ended up at the school that I love. So go off vibes and go off your gut instinct of and where you want to go, where you want to see yourself in the long run. But thank you so much Carter, for coming on and giving us such informational and like really good pieces of advice that I think many people will be appreciative of. And so be sure to check out, Harvard as a school to apply to, reach out to Carter, bug him with those little annoying questions. Also
Oh, for
consider any
sure.
other schools. Make sure to check out wavelf.org. We're doing a free summer camp this upcoming summer, so get ready to apply for that. And we'll see you next week.